If I told you that some of the most durable, efficient, and even earthquake-resistant buildings in history were made with no nails, no blueprints, no machines, and no cement, just sticks, stones, and sheer ingenuity, would you believe me? Because, buried in the past, beneath the castles and cathedrals that steal our breath, are construction methods so advanced, so harmoniously engineered with nature, that even modern builders are left scratching their heads. This isn't a romantic fantasy of the good old days. This is a confrontation with a truth we often overlook, that medieval builders, using only the simplest tools and materials, created structures that have not only lasted centuries, but outperformed many of our so-called modern marvels. How did they do it? How did a society without digital calculators, steel I-beams, or CAD software construct cathedrals that still rise like stone prayers against the sky? It starts not with technology, but with observation, patience, and a kind of respect for natural forces that we've mostly forgotten. Let's begin with one of the humblest yet most powerful inventions in human history: the dry stone wall. No mortar, no glue, just rock upon rock, fitted with such uncanny precision that some of these walls are still standing after 1,000 years. Picture that while skyscrapers built with rebar and concrete in the 20th century crumble under weather and time. Sheep fences, made by hand in the 10th century, still trace hillsides like scars of ancient logic. But the genius isn't just in the stacking. It's in what's missing. Medieval masons didn't slap rocks together at random. They read each stone like a page in a sacred book. They chose pieces that complemented each other's curves and weight, stones that would press into each other, interlock, and allow water to flow freely through instead of being trapped and frozen, causing cracks. They didn't fight gravity, they harnessed it. Each gap was intentional. Each layer had purpose. In fact, the wall flexed with the earth instead of resisting it. In a way, these walls breathed. Can you say that about modern construction, where one crack in a foundation can condemn an entire building? But walls were just the beginning. Let's talk about timber, the bones of the medieval home. You might think of wood as fragile, prone to rot or warping. But these builders turned timber into a dance. Mortise and tenon, joints, wooden puzzle pieces that locked together. Without nails formed frames, so sturdy and flexible that they could withstand earthquakes that would obliterate concrete. And here's where it gets wild. They would season their wood for years, waiting patiently for it to dry, so that when the pieces fit together, they would tighten with time, not loosen. These joints weren't just engineered. They were alive, adapting with the seasons. Whole communities would gather for a barn raising, lifting these complex interlocking frames into place like a living sculpture. The result? Buildings that moved with the earth, not against it. And they could be taken apart and moved if needed. An early version of modular, reusable architecture. We like to think IKEA invented flat-packed furniture. Medieval builders were already living it, just with more oxen and fewer Allen wrenches. Now, imagine you've got your frame and your walls. What about the roof? Enter the thatched roof, which sounds quaint until you realize it's one of the most sophisticated pieces of environmental engineering ever created from grass. Thatch wasn't slapped on with whimsy, it was layered in thick, overlapping bundles, sometimes over 2 feet deep, angled steeply so rain slid off instantly. These roofs provided natural insulation, kept homes warm in winter and cool in summer, and could last half a century with minimal maintenance. And all of it, from the frame to the roof to the foundation, was done with local materials. Communal labor and knowledge passed down not in textbooks, but through calloused hands and quiet observation. These weren't amateurs. These were master environmental engineers disguised as farmers and masons. And maybe the most astonishing part, they didn't leave behind manuals or manifestos. They left buildings. Buildings that whisper their secrets to those still willing to listen. And while those dry stone walls and timber frames might seem like rustic wonders to modern eyes, they were only the beginning of a deeper, more radical architectural intelligence, one that didn't just build structures, but read landscapes, coaxed materials into harmony, and shaped homes that could breathe, bend, and endure like living things, because to medieval builders, permanence wasn't about brute force, it was about cooperation with nature, and nowhere is that clearer than in their use of light, insulation, and even animal bladders. Yes, you heard that right, because long before glass windows became a norm, medieval households, especially poorer ones, needed a way to let in sunlight while keeping out the wind, rain, and bitter cold, and in their ingenuity, they turned to what they had on hand, the translucent, stretchable, semi-waterproof membranes of pig or cow bladders, washed clean, dried until thin as parchment, then oiled to resist the elements. These bladder windows were installed in wooden frames and let in just enough diffused light to brighten a room without exposing its occupants to the cold or the prying eyes of strangers. It might sound primitive, but it worked, and it made the difference between a dark cave and a livable home, proving once again that medieval people weren't just surviving, they were adapting, innovating, turning scraps into solutions. And while the nobility might have had imported glass, expensive, fragile, prone to cracking and theft, common people had windows that were cheap, replaceable, and shockingly effective, with the added benefit of privacy. You could see silhouettes and shapes from inside, but no one could truly see you, making even the humblest cottage feel like a small sanctuary. Now, let's talk walls, not the towering stone ramparts of castles, but the everyday walls of medieval homes, often made from nothing more than wood, mud, straw, and animal dung, and yet still standing in some villages today. The technique was called wattle and daub, and it was more than just slapping mud on sticks. It was engineering masquerading as folklore, with vertical wooden stakes forming the spine of the wall, and long, flexible rods woven horizontally like a basket between them, creating a resilient structure that moved with the wind and resisted collapse. Then came the daub, a precise mix of clay, chopped straw, water, and animal waste, spread in layers over the wattle until it hardened into a solid, breathable wall, one that provided insulation, absorbed moisture without rotting, and could be repaired using materials gathered from just outside the door. The use of dung wasn't a sign of poverty, but of chemistry. It added binding agents, natural fibers, and even antibacterial properties that made the walls stronger and more resistant to decay. Once dried and whitewashed with lime, which itself had mold-fighting properties, the result was a home that stayed warm in winter, cool in summer, and cost nothing but time, labor, and local knowledge. And just like with dry stone, medieval builders didn't resist nature, they worked with it, understanding that flexibility, not rigidity, was the key to longevity, and that every element, even something as overlooked as cow dung, could serve a vital purpose if you knew how to use it. And beneath those daub-covered walls and flickering, bladder-lit windows lay one of the most overlooked feats of medieval engineering, the foundation. But not the kind we think of today with poured concrete and rebar grids. No, these were rubble foundations, dug by hand, filled with whatever stones could be gathered from nearby fields or riverbeds. and designed with one clear principle in mind. Water must move away, not settle, because medieval builders may not have had PhDs in soil mechanics, but they knew from centuries of hard-won experience that stagnant water was the enemy of every structure. It rotted wood, cracked stone, and ruined entire homes with creeping damp. So they created what we might now call a French drain, but without the terminology or the marketing, with larger stones laid at the bottom of trenches to form drainage channels. Smaller ones layered on top to stabilize and filter all of it. Arranged so that rainwater flowed through and away from the base of the building, not into it. And the brilliance of this system wasn't just its effectiveness, it was its simplicity. No mortar, no expensive imports, just an understanding that gravity, when respected, could be a builder's greatest ally. And while foundations kept homes dry from below, another group of builders was taking advantage of the earth itself, not just as barrier, but as partner, creating what we now call earth-sheltered homes, carved into hillsides or buried beneath soil to stabilize internal temperature and shield against the worst of nature's fury. Because 3 feet underground, the earth maintains a near-constant temperature year-round, making these homes naturally cool in summer, warm in winter, and virtually immune to the bite of seasonal extremes. No central heating, no insulation. Foam, just stone, clay, and the patience to shape a house into the land itself. And it wasn't just comfort they were after, it was survival. These homes used less firewood, a precious resource as forests dwindled, and they offered better protection from storms, invaders, and even wild animals than any wooden cottage above ground ever could. In fact, many of these subterranean dwellings doubled as food, storage grain, vegetables, salted meats, all preserved by the steady, dry coolness of the earth, like medieval root cellars you could live in. And while the wealthy built up, reaching for spires and towers, the wise often built down, folding their homes into hills, letting the land become their armor. Even above ground, this knowledge shaped their heating systems. Because before chimneys, before stoves and flues, warmth came from a single source, a fire burning in the middle of the room on a stone hearth, with smoke slowly rising into the rafters and filtering out through holes in the roof or gaps in the walls. Not as inefficient as it sounds, because this central hearth heated the space evenly, allowed multiple people to cook at once, and most unexpectedly preserved the roof itself. Over time, the smoke left behind chemicals that seeped into the wooden beams, acting as a kind of natural pesticide and preservative, making the roof more resistant to insects and rot, and helping those same smoke-blackened timbers last not decades, but centuries. In a world without insulation, the fire did more than warm bodies at hardened homes, fumigated the structure, and bound the household together, not just physically, but emotionally. As meals were cooked, stories told, and winter endured beside its glow. And as we step through the tapered doorway of a medieval home, yes, tapered, because even something as simple as a doorframe carried the imprint of brilliance, we see that nothing in these structures was accidental. Not the angle of a wall, not the shape of an arch, not even the width of a hallway, and certainly not the way people entered or exited, because these doorways were wider on the inside than the outside, shaped almost like funnels, and it wasn't for decoration. It was function made beautiful. This clever narrowing helped control drafts, preventing cold air from rushing straight into the living space, instead forcing it to move through an angled path, losing energy as it went. In an age before insulation, that mattered immensely. But the benefits didn't stop there. Tapered doors were easier to defend from within during attacks, and structurally stronger because their angled frames distributed force more evenly, especially in stone constructions. And some of these doors had thick side walls deep enough to hold built-in stone benches, where you could sit, tie your boots, or watch the world pass by in peace. Another example of form meeting function in the most human way. Now step inside and look down, not at hardwood, not at tile or concrete, but at packed earth, carefully tamped and sealed, transformed into a surface that could last for decades with proper maintenance. Made from layers of clay, lime, straw, or ash, compacted until they were smooth and durable. And in some homes, that final seal was applied using animal blood, its proteins forming a hard, waterproof surface once dried macabre by today's standards, but wildly effective. Linseed oil was another common sealant, soaking into the earth to harden and repel moisture, creating floors that could be swept, wiped, repaired, or patched without needing to replace anything. In places where color or sanitation mattered, builders mixed lime and ash for a lighter antimicrobial surface that resisted mold and made rooms brighter. This wasn't just dirt they lived, and it was engineered earth shaped by knowledge of chemistry and climate, and it performed better than many modern natural floor alternatives. And above this firm ground rose the wooden frames joined not by nails or bolts, but by oak pegs, driven into mortise and tenon joints that were so precisely cut they became tighter over time, not looser. This is where medieval carpentry became something close to art, or maybe even magic, because these pegs cut from seasoned oak heartwood were designed to swell in wet weather and shrink during dry spells, allowing the structure to expand and contract without cracking or weakening. The result? Homes that breathed with the seasons, not against them, adjusting subtly to moisture and movement, and remaining intact for centuries. No rust, no corrosion, no stripped screws, just wood embracing wood, tightened by time and weather. And if a joint ever failed, it could be disassembled and rebuilt without tearing down the entire structure. Because the buildings weren't just beautiful, they were repairable, sustainable, and smart. And now, let's lift our gaze upward to one of the most whimsical yet scientifically sound elements of medieval homes, the roof. And not just the steep angle or the thick thatch, but the way water was guided, channeled, and ushered away like a constant, quiet battle fought by builders with no pumps, no PVC pipes, no chemical sealants, just a chisel, a beam, and an understanding of gravity. Because while modern homes often treat water as an afterthought, an issue to be handled when a leak springs, medieval builders started with water in mind from the very first stone laid. Drainage wasn't a feature, it was a philosophy, carved directly into the bones of the house, with gutters etched into stone blocks, wooden beams shaped to channel rain, and entire roof lines engineered not just for shelter, but for flow. And perhaps nowhere is this genius more visible than in the gargoyle, those wild, snarling creatures jutting from the sides of cathedrals, not just monstrous art, but fully functional waterspouts, directing rain far from the walls, protecting mortar and stone from centuries of erosion. Even humble homes had their version, timber gutters carved from single logs of rot-resistant wood, sealed with pitch or tar, sloped precisely to move water fast and far. Ground-level drainage used sloped trenches lined with stones to direct water away from the house's base, preventing pooling, erosion, and rot. And it didn't stop there. These builders understood how to harness the roof itself. crafting dramatic pitches of 45 degrees or more, so steep that rain and snow had no time to linger, no chance to seep, no opportunity to weigh down the frame. It was like a water slide made of straw or tile, sending every droplet racing to the earth below. And if you lived in the cold north, where snow could stack up like blankets on a ledge, this steep angle was your insurance shedding weight before it could collapse your ceiling, saving timber, saving lives. And yet, the roof did more than defend it, expanded the usable space inside, giving room for lofts, storage, even sleeping areas beneath the sloped beams. The very shape of the house told you it was built not just to last, but to adapt. And beneath these roofs, if you were lucky or wealthy, you might find a cellar, and not just a dark hole in the ground, but a marvel of medieval design. The barrel vault, a curved ceiling made of stone or brick, arched so perfectly that it supported itself without columns, distributing weight like a ripple in still water. These cellars were naturally cool, fire-resistant, immune to rodents, and ideal for storing everything from wine to preserved meats. The vault shape amplified their strength and protected goods even when fire consumed the wooden structure above. It's strange, isn't it, that beneath the roaring complexity of a Gothic cathedral or the quiet strength of a farmer's cottage, there lived the same principle: respect the forces you can't control, and design with them, not against them. And if light once guided rainwater with carved stone and sloped beams, then it also found its way into the medieval home through another act of thoughtful engineering light. Not in the electric sense, but as a treasured resource, a gift that needed amplification, not just admittance. Because in a world without bulbs or spotlights, without LEDs or chandeliers, every beam of natural light had to be stretched, reflected, made useful. And that's where the simple but powerful technique of lime-washing ceilings and walls came in. This wasn't just primitive paint. It was illumination, science by hand, lime mixed with water to form a thin, milky liquid that dried into a chalky white coating, reflecting every flicker of candlelight, every sliver of sunlight, and making small spaces feel brighter, cleaner, safer. Imagine a woman weaving or sewing in a dim cottage, her work lit not by lamps, but by the shimmer of a whitewashed ceiling, bouncing daylight around the room like a whisper. But lime wash wasn't just about brightness, had antifungal and antibacterial properties, protecting timber and daub from the slow creep of mold and decay, deterring insects, and preserving air quality in homes where ventilation was minimal and open fires smoldered day and night. And when applied to cellars or pantries, this humble layer of paint helped prevent food spoilage, extending the life of stored goods in ways invisible but essential. In churches, it became canvas scenes of saints and scripture painted over whitewash so that even the poorest congregations could feel enveloped in sacred beauty. But beauty, too, could be a tool, and medieval builders knew how to weaponize aesthetics against time, against weather, even against death, and nowhere was that more literal than in their use of charred wood as a preservation method. Yes, burning wood to protect it. It sounds backward, but it wasn't, because a carefully charred surface creates a carbon layer that resists moisture, insects, and rot better than many chemical treatments today. This technique, now rediscovered as shosugi-ban in modern architecture, was used centuries ago in Europe to armor wood for exterior use: fences, beams, planks that would otherwise weather and warp. And the process was delicate, a dance between fire and patience. Too little burn, and the protection failed. Too much, and the wood weakened. But done right, The result was blackened wood that shed water like slate and discouraged even the hungriest termites from chewing through. And while that may sound like advanced chemistry, remember they had no lab coats, no charts, no synthetic resins, just trial, error, and an unyielding desire to build something that would not only stand but outlast them. And maybe that's the through line of all of it. Not just endurance, but the belief that materials had potential beyond their surface, that mud could become wall, smoke could become shield, and even fire so often feared could become protector. If only you had the courage and knowledge to wield it gently. And as we near the end of this journey through ancient hands and hidden genius, there's one last secret buried in the stones, carved not for beauty or strength, but for identity, because medieval builders didn't just raise walls, they left behind marks, literal signatures, symbols etched into the very blocks they shaped, known as mason's marks. And these weren't graffiti or decoration, they were a system of accountability, pride, and organization long before punch cards or timesheets ever existed. Each stonemason had their own unique mark, often a simple shape or geometric figure, and when you walk through cathedrals or castles today, you can still see them: tiny triangles, crosses, or abstract runes, hiding in plain sight on centuries-old walls. These marks served multiple purposes. They helped foremen track who carved which stones, ensuring proper payment for piecework. But they also acted as quality control. A stone failed, they'd know who was responsible, and more than that, they offered a kind of legacy, a way for a worker whose name might never appear in a history book to say, "I was here, and I built this." And while these carved records gave structure to labor, the very structures themselves often relied on a surprising absence of tools: no lasers, no digital levels, not even standardized rulers, and yet the geometry was breathtaking, because medieval builders used ropes, stakes, and pure proportional reasoning to generate layouts that were not only structurally sound, but acoustically magical. They employed the 3-4-5 triangle to create perfect right angles, ratios like 1:2 or 2:3 to shape walls and arches, and circles drawn with rope as compasses to map out columns, apses, and domes. And with nothing more than intuition and iteration, they created buildings where sound flowed like water: churches, where a whisper at the altar could be heard clear at the nave, where choirs sang into curved ceilings that caught and carried their voices with zero distortion. It wasn't just architecture, it was performance design, centuries ahead of its time, all because someone noticed how stone shaped sound and chose to build around it, not in spite of it. And once all of that was done, once the walls had risen, the arches had locked, and the roof beams reached skyward, there remained one final gesture, one quiet protection that most passers-by never even noticed: the roof overhang. Not dramatic or ornate, but deeply intentional. These extended eaves served as shields, casting water outward, away from vulnerable foundations and entryways, reducing erosion and the slow death caused by trickling rain. They were paired with carved wooden brackets or stone corbels, decorative, yes, but also deeply structural, each one calibrated to hold weight, to support the angles, to resist time. And the wisdom here wasn't just in solving problems, but in preventing them, understanding that the best maintenance begins with foresight, with building something that works with the world around it, rather than trying to conquer it. And that's what makes medieval construction not just inspiring, but humbling, because it reminds us that architecture doesn't have to dominate a landscape to endure. It can listen, respond, and belong. And so, after walking through stone, straw, smoke, and silence, After touching the lines carved by hands long returned to dust, we arrive at the final truth buried beneath every medieval beam and vaulted ceiling. The past was never was deliberate, observant, and astonishingly wise. And the real miracle of medieval building isn't that it survived, but that it did so by embracing what modern systems often ignore: movement, decay, adaptation, and the elemental truths of the natural world. While today we rely on concrete, steel, and prefabricated design, they relied on memory, geometry, and the slow inheritance of craft passed down without blueprints, passed down through gestures and repetition, through failure and refinement, until what remained was not just a shelter, but a philosophy, a living record of how to build with time, not against it. Every decision, from the thatched roof's steep pitch to the careful seasoning of timber, from a daub wall's dung-rich formula to the drainage grooves carved into a single beam, reveals a mindset not driven by efficiency, but by belief that you can't truly own the land, only borrow space on it, and that the best homes are the ones that disappear back into the soil without damage when their time is done. And perhaps that's the final, quiet brilliance of medieval architecture. It wasn't designed to last forever, was designed to last long enough, to protect, to endure, and then to return, gracefully, into the same earth it once stood upon, leaving behind not waste or ruin, but knowledge, waiting to be remembered. And in a world today choking on over-engineering, on synthetic permanence, on a race to build faster and bigger with less soul, maybe it's time we look backward, for nostalgia, but for wisdom. Because if peasants with no formal education could create climate-adaptive homes from mud, smoke, and straw, if carpenters could craft earthquake-resistant frames with no screws or bolts, if masons could turn rainfall into sculpture and silence, into music, then what excuse do we have now, with all our technology, to build so carelessly? This isn't just a story of buildings, it's a lesson in humility, in observation, in learning to listen to materials, to weather, to the land beneath our feet. Because the most astonishing thing about medieval builders is not what they made, but how little they wasted, how much they understood, and how profoundly they trusted the wisdom of things left unsaid. Medieval builders didn't have machines, but they had mastery. They didn't rely on industrial materials, but on insight, humility, and generations of lived experience. They remind us that great construction isn't just about durability, about knowing when to yield, how to adapt, and how to build a home that works with the world, not against it. Their wisdom endures, not just in stone and timber, but in the way it still dares us to build better.